Labour tensions over its position on Israel-Gaza. Where will refugees granted asylum be housed? And could Rishi Sunak be facing another by-election? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Tom Hunt, Labour MP Lloyd Russell-Moyle, Politico's UK editor Jack Blanchard and the Financial Times' Whitehall editor Lucy Fisher. On today's programme.
The electricity keeps cutting out and we're completely dependent on the fuel, which I understand is no longer coming in.
Calls for a pause to fighting on both sides to ease the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
You go with this one.
As 2 more Israeli hostages are released.
My mom is telling the horrific stories. She's saying that many people, a swarm of people, came through the fence.
Here, Keir Starmer comes under pressure over his stance on the conflict.
It's right for Keir to listen to those concerns and to reaffirm the Labour Party position.
The question has to be, if not those hotels, then where?
The government says it's moving asylum seekers out of hotels, but could many, having been granted asylum, soon be moving back in? How it started.
I will unite our country, not with words, but with action.
How it's going. In the aftermath of 2 by-election defeats, Rishi Sunak marks a year as Prime Minister. He'll face Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions at noon. We'll bring you that live. Welcome. Let's start with this story in The Independent. Rishi Sunak carries out Liz Truss' plan to axe cap on bankers' bonuses. The cap was brought in by the EU in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. The cap on those bonuses will be lifted from the 31st of October, the regulator has said. My opening question to you all is, do you welcome it?
Well, I mean, I welcome anything that encourages wealth creation in this country. You know, I think it benefits a country having a healthy, vibrant financial sector, and I think to have a healthy, vibrant financial sector, you have to attract talent from all over the world. I don't want anything in place, though, that incentivises the wrong kind of behaviour, and I think we certainly saw a bit of that through.
Well, that's why it was put in place, wasn't it?
I think ultimately it's about trying to get the balance right between attracting talent but not doing anything that incentivises behaviour which is bad for the country.
Right. Do you welcome it?
No, I think that what's happening is Rishi is just delivering Liz Truss's pledges. Liz has said jump.
Well, he might be, but do you agree with them?
Liz has said jump and Rishi has said how high. And he is implementing this, which is totally unnecessary, totally the wrong policies for what we need. Now, what we need is a proper fair tax system that deals with this and other forms of income fairly across the board.
Right. But this isn't a tax, is it? It's the cap on bonuses being lifted.
It is a system that stops the amount that people can get from bonuses and shifts reward in a different direction. And at the moment, it was there to make sure that behaviours worked in the right way, and rather than tweaking it or improving it if it needed to be done, the absolute scrapping of it, I think, will send the wrong messages and won't particularly help, I don't think, the city grow as they desire.
What do you make of the announcement?
I mean, the politics of it are pretty interesting. It's a funny way to spend your first year anniversary in office, isn't it? Like bringing in one of your predecessor, your not entirely popular predecessor's policy, and the optics of it are pretty grim. Like, bankers are generally not the public's #1 profession. They're right down there with journalists and politicians.
We're vying for the bottom place.
Exactly, proudly. So I think it's a strange one. They're obviously doing it because, as Tom says, they're trying to create some sort of boost for businesses. But I do think, you know, that it was brought in for a reason. Probably we'll find out if this is a really bad idea in about 10 years' time, if banks slowly get more and more reckless again. And it's quite hard to know at this point if that'll be the case.
I mean, on the cap itself, it is interesting, the debate about whether it might attract investment or whether it might lead, yet again, to the sort of excessive risk-taking that triggered the EU to bring it in the first place.
Yeah, look, this has been a review carried out by the Financial Conduct Authority and the Bank of England's Prudential Regulation Authority. They found that it was affecting labour mobility, damaging the competitiveness of the City of London. I've been quite interested that it was welcomed quite cautiously by finance bosses themselves when it was first raised by Kwasi Kwarteng last autumn. I think in part because they feared the public backlash that we're seeing in the past 24 hours. And also, they've had to permanently increase their staff salary already. They can't now row back from that. They're legally obliged to sort of to uphold those salaries. So they don't have as much room for manoeuvre with their current staff bodies. It makes a bit of difference with future hires for them.
Let's take a look at this BBC headline. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, to meet Labour Muslim MPs amid tensions over Gaza policy. He will be meeting those MPs this afternoon after Prime Minister's questions. There's been growing frustration amongst a number of Muslim members of the Labour Party over the leadership's stance on the Israel-Gaza war. This is what Keir Starmer said on LBC a few weeks ago.
Israel does have that right to defend herself, and Hamas bears responsibility.
A siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law.
So that was Keir Starmer supporting Israel's right to defend itself after the massacre of 1,400 Israelis by Hamas, designated a terrorist organisation by the government here. That attack and massacre took place in the south of the country. But answering questions about then the siege by Israel on Gaza, a number of Labour councillors resigned, including Shaista Aziz, a councillor in Oxford. This is what she said.
The government and the opposition need to call for an immediate end of lethal force inside Gaza, disproportionate force, which is illegal under international law. They need to call for an immediate ceasefire.
We spoke to Shaista Aziz last week. Subsequently, Keir Starmer gave an interview to the BBC's Chris Mason, and said this.
There are, innocent civilians in Gaza in a humanitarian crisis, 1 million children. That aid urgently needs to get in. So I was saying, yes, they have the right to self-defence. That right they do have, but not the right to withhold that humanitarian aid that needs to get in. It is now absolutely urgent, and that's why I've been calling for this for over a week. So I'm very pleased to be able to clarify precisely what I was saying in that LBC clip.
Has he actually clarified what he was saying in that clip, Lloyd?
Well, I think he has. The clip was phrased poorly, I think, and I think everyone acknowledges that it's got into a bit of a muddle. I think Keir's quite right to meet Muslim MPs. I think he should meet Jewish MPs as well, which he's not yet done, and I hope that that meeting will happen quickly as well. People who are concerned about this will need to be speaking to their leader and feeding into it. But I do think it is clear now that we must have sympathy for people in Israel. We must totally condemn Hamas. We must ask for the hostages to be released. But that does not mean you give a blanket ticket to Israel to do whatever it wants. And I know from personal experience, I had friends who were murdered by the terrorist in Norway when he went and started killing Labour members there. And my initial reaction was a knee-jerk reaction. I wanted hell and brimstone on that person and anyone linked to him. But it is our responsibility when someone is hurting to say we have full sympathy for you, but we also understand that when you are hurting, you aren't always the best person to work out what the limits of your response are. And the international law is designed to say to someone, we understand you're hurting, we understand justice must happen, but you cannot overstep that mark. You cannot cause collective punishment. You cannot cut off supplies to an area that you're occupying and you already surround. You cannot do those things because international law has been developed to balance those things, even though we understand you are dreadfully hurting. And I think probably the UN Secretary General is putting that in the right kind of position, saying we need a ceasefire, but we need a ceasefire that also says we need the hostages released. And you can call for both at the same time.
Well, let's just briefly unpick some of what you said, because we'll talk about the ceasefire. I know you've signed the early day motion. I think it is calling for a ceasefire. You want to hear that from the Labour leader. So far, neither Keir Starmer Starmer nor Rishi Sunak are doing that. But to go back to the limits of international law, if Israel has a right to defend itself, how far does that go in terms of its actions in Gaza when it comes to, it would say, rooting out the Hamas and the terrorists, as the government describes them, the terrorists that committed that massacre? Does that include cutting off water and electricity supplies?
No, it doesn't include.
And have you heard that clearly enough from Keir Starmer?
I think we are starting to hear that now, but it could have come earlier. I think that what we need to be clear about is that those humanitarian supplies, not only more broadly in a conflict, need to be let through, but if you are an occupying country or a territory that is occupied, you have the rights for things that under normal circumstances, you wouldn't always have the right to be delivered to you from someone else. And that is different in international law.
Do you agree with Lloyd?
No, I mean, I think Israel have an absolute right to defend itself, and I think it's easy for people to say. I mean, of course, you know, I'm more and I'm desperately sad to see the suffering we're seeing on all sides. I went to the kibbutz, in one of the kibbutz where one of the massacres happened 4 years ago. I went there. I had lunch there, you know, and I only realised I went to that specific one a few days ago. But we want the killing to stop. We want peace to be returned. But I'm not entirely sure just saying ceasefire is going to achieve that, because Hamas will still be there. And Hamas are a terrorist organisation who are hell-bent on the destruction of Israel and killing Jews. So it's easy to say ceasefire, but what does that actually mean in practice? Because we'll just go back to a situation where we're waiting until the next time, and the next time, and the next time. And Hamas decide to do exactly the same thing again.
And so that does mean Israel has a right to cut off water and fuel supplies, then?
I mean, I think they've got a right to take the steps they believe are necessary to defend Israel. And I.
But do they have the right to break international law?
Of course, all steps should be taken to minimise the suffering of innocent civilians. But that's made very difficult when Hamas used innocent civilians as human shields.
But does that then... I mean, the question is, if someone is using an innocent civilian as a human shield, just like if someone, you know, kind of a hostage down the road suddenly is taken and they've got a gun to their head, does that give the right for the police trying to break that hostage situation up to shoot the innocent civilian? No. What that means is that you need more caution. You need more ability to make sure we understand this is a complex situation. And of course, when people say ceasefire, I don't mean that suddenly there should be no further action from Israel at all. What we mean is blanket bombings and mass movements of people can't be part of the framework in which they are taking action. But we all want, and I think we should redouble, action against Hamas. But I think Joe Biden put it well. He said, when America was hurt after 9/11, we didn't get it right because we reacted with our gut rather than with our head. And I think that's the messages that, as allies, we need to be sending to our friends.
How difficult is this for Keir Starmer?
I think it's turning into a really big problem, and we're seeing that today. Angela Rayner's being fielded to meet with Muslim MPs and peers who have escalating concerns. And I think actually particularly in the past 24 hours with Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, coming out and saying that Israel has committed clear violations of international law, also saying that Hamas's October the 7th attacks didn't happen in a vacuum. I think that will give more cover to Labour MPs, Labour front benches perhaps, who feel very strongly that the party is not in the right place on this issue, perhaps to speak up publicly. And I think Keir Starmer's got a real problem on his hands keeping the party unified.
How big a problem do you think it is for Keir Starmer?
I mean, it was always going to go this way. You know, from the very start, Keir Starmer made a decision that he was going to stand right shoulder to shoulder with Israel, right shoulder to shoulder with Rishi Sunak, essentially, on this. He read the runes, basically, and decided politically that was exactly the right place for him to be. And he will have known that Israel was going to react very strongly, and he will have known that when they did, he was going to come under a lot of pressure, particularly from within his own party, and that was always going to play out this way, and it is. I think his judgment is, politically, he would rather be in this place than be being accused of not being an ally of Israel in this situation. And he would rather have this sort of pressure than the alternative.
It does seem a little bit like he's tying himself in knots over the issue, to be quite frank. You know, and it is welcome that we have a Labour Party leader who is now describing Hamas for what they are, which is a terrorist organisation.
Yeah,
but let us not forget, well, Jeremy Corbyn described Hamas as friends. And we shouldn't forget that. And we shouldn't forget the fact that Keir Starmer tried to make that man the Prime Minister of our country twice. we shouldn't forget that. It is relevant. It is relevant for us to talk about that. It is relevant for us to reflect upon that.
And it's for exactly that sort of reason.
I was going to say, is that the reason that Keir Starmer has taken the position?
Has made the judgment that he has. And as I say, I think he would rather be facing this sort of pressure. But I do think it's going to increase as the days go on, and especially if Israel, the ground invasion then happens, we're going to see more terrible scenes, whether you think that's the right thing to do or not.
It is a changing situation. You are seeing hostages being released. You are seeing, kind of sometimes hospitals being denied fuel. Some of that wasn't clear at the beginning. It is right that a leader reflects the current changing situation. It is right that we reflect the international mood and we work as an international community and we take leadership from the UN General Secretary. So I think that I would never expect our leader to take one position and never to have nuance and change. I would have preferred to have got to the place where we were a bit quicker, but I always want to get to places quicker on all policy issues.
Right, well, let me just show you this tweet by Keir Starmer, perhaps as the position is evolving. I was grateful to hear from the Muslim community of the South Wales Islamic Centre. I repeated our calls for all hostages, Israeli hostages, to be released by Hamas, more humanitarian aid to enter Gaza, for the water and power to be switched back on, and a renewed focus on the two-state solution. But yesterday, a response was issued on behalf of the centre that we've just described by the Muslim Council of Wales, apologising for the hurt and confusion that the decision to host the visit had caused many in the Muslim community. It said our intention was to raise the concerns of the Muslim community around the suffering of Palestinians. There was a robust and frank conversation which reflected the sentiments Muslim communities are feeling at this time. We wish to stress Keir Starmer's social media post and images gravely misrepresented our congregants and nature of the visit. What do you make of that statement? Is he misrepresenting Muslims?
Well, I wasn't at that visit. What I do know is that Palestine, more broadly, is a touchstone issue for British Muslims, more so than other issues around, kind of the Uyghur Muslims or the, kind of people in Burma. And Palestine is a touchstone, and so it is much more intense. The feelings, the emotions here, and it's the same also, of course, with the Jewish community and Israel. And so it does require sensitive navigating. I think that's why it requires also leadership to say things like ceasefires, things like stopping hostilities are important to give humanitarian breaks in.
But actually, on the basis
of what don't hear then they feel like one side is being preferenced over the other, and that is of course always going to be difficult.
It is very difficult
to walk.
It is.
And I have no desire necessarily to be in the job of having to walk that tightrope.
No, I'm sure you don't, as the rest of us might share that. But on that basis, do you think that Keir Starmer's at risk of losing Muslim support over this, if it's such the touchstone issue, perhaps more than any other when it comes to foreign affairs?
Yes, I do, and I think that that's what he's being told loud and clear from some of his MPs that represent seats with significant British Muslim populations. I think one other big problem that's emerging in Labour is the leadership's attempt to try and stifle debate, not allow local parties to even have debates that may see views that go against the leadership aired. I think that's another flashpoint that's going to erupt in coming weeks, unless the leadership allows people to deviate from their line, or their line evolves more in step with what some British Muslims and some quarters of the left in the party think.
Could it cost them electorally?
I mean, it might do. I mean, there are parts of the country where Labour do definitely rely on votes from this community to hold their seats, so it's not impossible. I mean, the election's obviously a year away, so it's very hard to make predictions like this far out. And it very much depends on how skillfully Keir Starmer handles the next few days and weeks, I would say. You know, we saw Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, overnight talking about possibly the need for humanitarian pauses.
Right.
Now, once the United States of America is saying that, it gives cover to a lot of people who go, well, if the United States have got a very good thought here, and you might, if I was Keir Starmer, I'd be rowing in behind that.
Well, and a pause, of course, is very different from a ceasefire in that sense. So let's just hear, because you both mentioned the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres and his comments yesterday that caused absolute fury in Israel and with Israeli politicians. He told a Security Council meeting that Israel had committed clear violations, while, of course, condemning the attack by Hamas, the massacre in the south of Israel. But let's just have a listen to the exchange.
It is important to also recognise the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation.
And the SG is blaming the victim, you are blaming Israel? This is a pure blood libel. This is a pure blood libel, and I think that the Secretary General must resign.
So that was the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, responding, calling for Antonio Guterres to resign. What did you make of Antonio Guterres' comments that the massacre hadn't happened in a vacuum and linking it or put in context of 56 years of suffocating occupation?
To put it baldly, I was quite surprised he took such a political line, you know, leading a body that needs to kind of try and keep all nations of the world on board. And now it's lost the confidence of Israel. To my mind, it's sort of obvious that that would happen when he aired those views.
What do you make? Do you think he should resign?
I mean, I was pretty shocked by what he had to say. I think it's absolutely right that he shows concern for the people of Palestine and the people of Israel. But I think what he said, you know, it was almost coming up with some kind of soft justification for what was the most shocking, sickening attack on Jewish people since the Second World War. And I do have concerns about the UN. I do find it interesting how all of the things they don't seem to get themselves organised. They seem to fail to get themselves organised to condemn all sorts of different things. Whenever it comes to Israel, the UN are absolutely, they seem to be there to condemn them. And I think what he said, and if I sympathise with what the Israelis have been saying in response to that.
Right. I mean, does it look as if he's taken a side here, Antonio Guterres?
No, I think it is the role sometimes of international institutions to try and put things in context, and that is very difficult when people are hurting and there's been an immediate...
And a massacre of 1,400 Israelis is being put in context here, is it?
No. The ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine, and let's be honest, there is an ongoing conflict, and anyone that suggests that it's not an ongoing conflict...
But he said it wasn't right to say that it had happened in a vacuum.
But clearly, what's happened is Hamas have tortured and brutalised Palestinians and Israelis. They need to have the most condemnation needs to, of course, be focused against them. They are outstep of all international laws, but at the same time, good negotiation. And I think Colm, the leader of the SDLP, put this well on the first day that we came back. He said that, you know, awful atrocity is not solved by further awful atrocities. And they understand in Northern Ireland the only way you resolve this, in the end, is to do the difficult thing, which is to negotiate with people that are willing to negotiate. So that's not Hamas, but that is other Palestinians, to have a stable two-state solution. And that's what we all need to redouble and work to. And people who just want to say we need to be supporting one side or another in this, actually, I think you lose the innocent victims on all sides, the innocent victims of Hamas on all sides.
I think the most charitable view of what he said was that it was an extremely poor choice of words and was incredibly insensitive. That is the most charitable view that I can come up with in response to what he said. And if I was Jewish, or if I was living in Israel, particularly if I was a relative of one of the victims, or I would be incredibly hurt by what he said. And I understand their strength of feeling.
But aren't the people in Palestine and their friends and relatives incredibly hurt?
But that's a point.
Incredibly hurt by when people say, we accept that Israel can do what they want. The problem is hurt is on all sides. And hurt can't be the way that we negotiate peace.
I'm absolutely...
Hurt has to be something we recognise and we support.
Can I be clear? I'm absolutely not saying the UN should be taking sides when it comes to Israel-Palestine, but we should all take a side when it comes to Hamas. And that needs to be unequivocal and clear.
I totally agree.
And he's now blurred that.
Let's talk about the announcement yesterday by Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister, and this is about closing hotels that have been housing asylum seekers. He said that 50 hotels will be closed to asylum seekers by January, and the government will not stop there. However, it's emerged that issue or problem might be passed on to local authorities, the problem of finding housing, suitable housing for either asylum seekers or those who have gained refugee status. Let's talk to our political reporter, Jack Fenwick. What have local authorities told you, Jack?
Well,
Joe, I've been speaking to local authorities after that announcement you mentioned by the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick. He told MPs yesterday that the government would stop using an initial group of 50 of these hotels that have been housing asylum seekers. We know that, thanks to a BBC Freedom of Information request, that as of the start of July, the government were paying for 380 of these hotels. A first lot of 50 are going to go, and Robert Jenrick says that more are going to stop being used after that. Now, it's important to understand this interview as to why that announcement happened yesterday. It's because this thing called the legacy backlog, that's asylum claims made before the 28th of June last year, has been coming down. It was at around 92,500 in December, and it's now at around 55,500. And that's because claims for people seeking asylum are being processed much more quickly. That's where this interview that I've done with the Local Government Association comes in. So Sean Davies, who is also a Labour councillor and chairs the Local Government Association, therefore speaks for councils across England and Wales, is concerned about the speed of those claims being processed. He says that many of those people will be accepted. The Refugee Council says that at least 70% of asylum claims tend to be accepted in this country. And that because of the time frame people are then given to exit Home Office accommodation and find somewhere to live themselves, Sean Davies says that lots of people will be presenting to their councils as homeless. He's then worried that that means that pressure just moves away from the Home Office and onto local authorities, which is something he says many councils can't afford to deal with.
Right. I mean, Jack, how will local authorities cope with the influx, obviously an increased influx of processed refugees looking for somewhere to live?
So the numbers that the Local Government Association claim are involved are pretty big. They say that it's not just the people that have been in these hotels, but it's also Afghan refugees that could be coming here, and also potentially Ukrainian refugees who used to be paired with hosts, and maybe that's no longer happening. He says that they're expecting there could be up to 60,000 people seeking help of this sort from local authorities around the country between now and the end of the year. He says that there's not enough temporary accommodation across the country to cope with that number of people. And it's important to note at this point that Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister, has been doing the morning round of interviews on TV and radio this morning, and he was asked about this. Now, he said that the government are standing up other temporary accommodation forms beyond the hotels so that local authorities won't face all the pressure. He mentioned barracks and barges. Now, we don't know whether that's the Bibby Stockholm barge and barracks like the one at Scampton in Lincolnshire, or whether the government are going to stand up other accommodation like that as well. But what Sean Davies says is that he's worried that the very hotels that the government is about to stand down may have to be wound back up by local authorities struggling to find anywhere else to put these people. We can have a look now what he said to me.
The deep irony is that it might be that the same hotels that the Home Office are looking to close down for their purposes are the very same hotels that local authorities will have to stand up and fund for temporary accommodations. One part of the system might boast that they're doing relatively well, but actually they're shunting the issue and the cost to local taxpayers.
So all of that leads to the question, what does Sean Davies, what do the Local Government Association want to happen? Well, firstly, he's annoyed that the government haven't been talking to him before yesterday's announcement. He's annoyed that he's still not aware of the list of 50 hotels that will be part of that first group. And finally, he wants more funding from central government to local government to help them deal with this pressure.
Jack Fenwick, thank you. I mean, Tom, the BBC's reported that a Novotel in your constituency in Ipswich will be among the first to stop housing migrants. But what do you make of the fact that local authorities, including yours, will probably need to use hotels to house asylum seekers that have been granted refugee status?
So I had a further email today from the Home Office about that decision. And I think by the end of next month, that hotel will cease to be used for asylum accommodation.
And might it be reopened?
They also made clear in the email that none of what's happening should put an additional pressure on the local council, and that all of those in the hotel will be moved elsewhere on the asylum estate across the country.
Where? Oh, right. So just not in your constituency, but in other constituencies.
Some of that would be in ex-military. Well, we haven't got any big ex-military sites, in
so you've had a clarification, have you, from the government that there won't be any extra pressure or extra refugees coming to your constituency?
Yes. So they said they do not envision there being any significant extra pressure on the local authority. They said that they'll be transferred elsewhere on the asylum estate. And some of that would be in ex-military sites being brought back into use, and also barges. And of course, let's not forget, if the Rwanda scheme gets approved by the Supreme Court, some will be eligible to go there.
Well, what do you make of that? Or do you think Tom is crossing his fingers insofar as thinking there's not going to be extra pressure on local authorities and perhaps no extra funding? There might be a bit.
Well, if the government succeeded in finally speeding up the processing of asylum claims, which has been an ongoing disaster at the Home Office for years, then it's perfectly reasonable that a lot of people might end up presenting home at the end of it, but it might not be in Tom's constituency, but they'll be somewhere. And you have to wonder if it's been thought through. Like, I don't know, but the government does not have a wonderful... And I don't mean this is a political point. Like, no. Our governments do not have a wonderful track record of joining these things up, and you could well imagine this becoming the next problem that nobody's really thought about.
Right, but do you welcome the fact that the process is being speeded up successfully in terms of, I think it's an 80% success rate, resulting in perhaps up to 60,000 or so people gaining refugee status? Is that a good thing?
The illegal Migration Act made it clear that if you arrive here illegally from another safe European country, France, you shouldn't be able to stay here in any.
Right, but these are people, asylum seekers here at the moment. Are you pleased that the backlog is being worked through?
We've got to sort out the backlog, but frankly, but that doesn't involve just green lighting and rubber stamping every application. But ultimately, though, I do think there's a point about how you look at the percentage that have been granted refugee status in the UK. It's actually significantly higher than many other comparable European countries. There's also a point about refugee convention as well, and whether some of those international conventions need to be looked at. But ultimately, what we need to do is stop the small boats, and you can only do that with a deterrent. There's no example of any country effectively tackling this issue without a deterrent.
Well, I understand, but just on the issue here, now we've had this announcement, Lloyd, is 70 or up to 80% a good rate? Is it rubber stamping or green light to people gaining refugee status?
Well, I think it shows that most people who do come over are genuine refugees.
Which it did before, but at a much slower rate.
I think what let's be honest, a year and a half ago, there were 200 hotels, just slightly over, being used. There are now just under 400 hotels being used. So getting rid of 50 of them overall still means a year and a half ago...
I think it's 100 by next spring,
we had less, and we'll be back to just the baseline of what we had. Now, what we need to do is increase the processing. That's why Labour's going to have 1,000 new processors, because these hotels cost £8 million a day for people to be housed in. And if that money was spent actually in
local authorities like yours, for example.
Local authorities. And giving local authorities flexibility, because once someone's been given an asylum status, refugee status, actually, I want them to be integrated into the community, and I want people to... And so actually the Home Office giving money to local authorities to be able to support that process is what should happen, rather than warehousing people, because it's actually in the warehousing that you get community cohesion problems. It's in the warehousing that you don't allow people to contribute well to society. And that is a problem when 80% of them are genuine.
So it's real progress,
the absolute critical thing is we get a workable deterrent. I think it's interesting that the Labour Party said that even if the Rwanda policy is working,
what about the people... The story today is the people who are already here and where they are housed. You would welcome them to your constituency, although you say you're...
I mean, what I think was particularly grating for many of my constituents, particularly during the cost of living pressures, when they were struggling to pay their energy bills, struggling to put food on the table, and they saw a load of... And they were all men in a 4-star hotel getting free meals, everything.
Nice.
So that struck at the heart of the fairness argument, and that angered many of my constituents. So I think, could you let me finish?
Have you been to any of these hotels or these emergency accommodations?
It's difficult if I can't finish.
Hang on. Finish your point. And then
but ultimately, it is right that we move people who are into basic, cheap accommodation. That's much better than putting them in 4-star hotels. It costs less, and I think it's much fairer, much more appropriate. But ultimately, if you arrive here illegally, you should not stay here.
These people were legal. These people are 80% plus actual refugees. So this whole illegal argument is complete misnomer. What we need to talk about is the people who are here, how they need to be housed and supported. And how they need to be housed and supported is proper integration into the community, but there needs to be funding behind that for local authorities to do it.
You've talked about cohesion. Hang on. You've talked about community cohesion. I just want to play this, something you said, Tom, at a fringe event at the Conservative Party conference earlier this month. Let's have a listen.
Being frank, it is not xenophobic to, when you walk into your town centre, to not want to feel like you're living in a foreign country. I don't think that makes you a xenophobe. I think that makes you somebody who wants to live in a community with shared values.
What do you mean it feels like you're living in a foreign country?
Well, look, I mean, ultimately, I think if you're, I think most people in this country would actually agree with that view. And I think the whole, yes, actually, I think they would do. And I think the key point here is integration. And I strongly believe that when you get integration, diversity is a power for good. It adds vibrancy to communities. But I think when you don't get integration, it's impossible. It's very hard to get shared values.
And are you saying
that's when it can become problematic.
And that's how people feel in Ipswich?
Actually, the comments I was making were in relation to somewhere else, which somebody in the audience raised. So actually, the comments were in relation to his place.
Right.
He mentioned, and he said,
a mythical place.
He didn't say he was in the audience.
But how would you know? Because if you do look at Ipswich, because we looked at it in the 2021 census, over 84% of people in Ipswich identified their ethnic group within the white category, and the English is their main, 88% in fact, of people speak English as their main language. So when you say something that feels like living in a foreign country...
We have significant antisocial behaviour problems in our town centre. And a lot of the people carrying out those, whether it's for shoplifting or some other problems, but they've recently come here, and we have a problem with integration when it comes to one particular community.
Right. Well, Tom, you were asked about this on Sky last night. I'll let you come back in a moment. But you were asked about this on Sky last night and asked for the data that actually backs up your claim that many of the thefts or shoplifting or, as you say, low-level crime issues, not all low-level, are committed by foreigners. Where is that data?
So the police hold the data, but you know what I'd like to do. You know what I'd like to do to anyone who's questioning what I've said. Come with me to Ipswich. Meet me at the train station at Ipswich, and I'll take you to a dozen town centre shops. And you can speak to them, and they've got views from across the political spectrum, but they were all said exactly the same thing. And I met about
that's anecdotal, I would say.
And I've got a responsibility to represent my constituents. I've got a responsibility.
Will you take Lloyd? Lloyd will come on Saturday to Ipswich.
This Saturday, let me have a look.
If you're there.
Oh, OK, but give me a date.
And
by the end of the
come back.
Let's shake on a date.
Say Saturday. So what am I doing?
Well, you can do your diary things, but in principle, would you take Lloyd round, and will you actually find a date, Lloyd?
I'm in Ipswich. Of course, I'm always in Ipswich at the weekend. I'm in Ipswich this Saturday, and Lloyd. We don't share the same political views, but actually
I'm happy to speak to people on the ground.
Exactly. So if you want to come to Ipswich and you'd rather be there than you're
I'm free this Saturday, but I'm free next Saturday.
And let us know, and then come back and tell us what you both found and what you discussed.
So are you disputing what the 12 town centre businesses said to me then?
No, well, I want
because there's a police superintendent there in all those meetings.
He's agreed to come and see for himself, and you can talk to them.
Let's hear from them, and we can both come back to the show and report both of our interpretations.
I think he just wants to come back on the show soon, isn't it?
Beautiful thing you've
it is.
This is
Right, well, I'll let you do. I
in
just want to get your
live
comment,
action.
both Lucy and Jack, on the issue of. Let's talk about the small boats briefly. Is Rishi Sunak making progress on this?
Well, look, the numbers are significantly lower year on year at this point in the year. A large part of that, of course, is down to the Albania deal that he struck. However, he's nowhere near getting to the point of stopping the boats altogether, which is what he pledged. And one thing I'd just like to add as well, in the discussion about the importance of integration of people who settle in the UK permanently, the shutting the hotels has led to a huge explosion of fear that this is going to see homelessness rates soaring. The British Red Cross has said its refugee services have had a 140% increase in people seeking asylum or with asylum status reporting themselves homeless or destitute since the government changed its policy. If there's an outstreaming of people onto the streets or into very precarious temporary accommodation, research this month suggests that 50,000 asylum seekers could be on the streets by the end of this year. I mean, that's going to worsen the problems of community tension or lack of community cohesion that Tom has been talking about.
Right, we have Prime Minister's questions in just over 5 minutes' time. It's a year ago today. Those observant amongst you might have noticed that Rishi Sunak walked up, Downing Street, and delivered his first words as Prime Minister. He said his government would be led by integrity, professionalism and accountability. Let's take a listen.
I've just been to Buckingham Palace and accepted His Majesty the King's invitation to form a government in his name. This government will have integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level. Trust is earned, and I will earn yours.
Jack, has he earned that trust?
I mean, the poll ratings would suggest not. I would say he started OK. I mean, if you think back to where we were when he came in, my goodness, this country was all over the show, wasn't it? And he certainly did a reasonable job of normalising things, sort of back to the sort of we're all right at things but not that good sort of level that we tend to put along at in the government in this country. And he had some early wins. The Windsor Framework deal was a biggie, and he got that through his party, and people didn't think that was possible. Illegal migration bill as well, he would see that as a big win, and since then it's not gone so well, I would say, and he started to the poll gap with Keir Starmer started to fall away again. Each of those by-elections is like a body blow, like he's like that knight in the Monty Python sketch. Another limb gets chopped off, but he's still going to win the election, honestly.
I'm glad you've reminded me of that.
Each time you lose another one, you think, oh, and it's getting closer now. And there's a sort of sense that he hasn't really managed to stamp his authority on the party or on government, and a lot of people don't really know still what Rishi Sunak is all about, beyond not being Liz Truss and not being completely bonkers.
Right, well, actually, this graph that we're about to show you of the leaders' approval ratings underlines pretty well everything that Jack Blanchard has said. You can see when he first came in as leader and as Prime Minister, his approval ratings were significantly higher, but you can see the gap has widened in exactly the way Jack has said. You see Keir Starmer on plus 11% with his approval rating and Rishi Sunak down 14%. Would you agree with the analysis there, Tom, by Jack Blanchard?
Look, I mean, I think if you look at the last year, if we look at some of the things like inflation heading in the right direction, something massively prioritised by a Prime Minister. I think on the Windsor Framework, I think he demonstrated great statecraft. And I think actually recently his leadership on the issue in Ukraine and also in Israel as well, his recent visits to the Middle East, I thought was, him as a statesman. So, but a lot of this stuff's going to take time, and I think a lot of people.
Well, has he got the time? Well, I think a lot of people in the. I think some sections of the media, I think, are underestimating the ability for things to change. I think things. Look at illegal migration, for example. Imagine we've looked at it.
Well, imagine the dial being shifted on that. Imagine a positive Supreme Court case, flights going to Rwanda, and actually, I think we're quite close on something like illegal migration to actually really delivering in a big way. We've made some progress in terms of the numbers.
And you think that could turn around that minus approval rating?
For 2019 Conservative voters, immigration's the number one issue.
All right. I mean, Lloyd, when you look back a year ago and Liz Truss was Prime Minister, would you say it's been a vast improvement or not?
Well, I think, as I said earlier on, Rishi seems to have a nicer gleam about him, kind of better optics for the public, but he is fundamentally pursuing a lot of Liz Truss's policies on the bankers' bonuses, for example.
Anything else?
He's not really on immigration and on the boats. All of these are old policies, and they're not working. They don't work, and they never have worked. And I think the public now want someone stable and secure. And if you look at that line for Keir Starmer, it is I mean, of course, it goes up and down a little bit, but it's consistently positive.
Well,
it's consistently not necessarily that the public have a great fanfare, but the public are fed up, I think, with fanfare politicians, and they want someone that they know that will steer this country in a stable direction. And Rishi, I'm afraid, is steering the country downwards. We have
all right. Well, let me get Lucy. Yeah.
We have none of his 6 targets have been met, and they are not going to be met by the end of the period.
Well, we don't know, of course, do we? But it's by the end of the year in terms of halving
the direction of travel makes it almost impossible.
Looking at those net approval ratings, yes, you can see Keir Starmer on plus 11 or positive rating of 11%. Does that show clearly the popularity of Keir Starmer, or is it more about the unpopularity from that particular poll of Rishi Sunak?
Well, that's the big debate in Westminster. Are Labour just benefiting from the hangover of the turmoil of the Johnson and Truss era and how long it's taken Rishi Sunak to try and turn that around? Or, is he someone who can inspire the public? His ratings are far below the likes of Tony Blair at this stage in the electoral cycle before he won a landslide. My personal view is that, it's often called the Keir crouch. When Keir Starmer feels on the back foot, he looks quite nervous. He resorts to this default furrowed brow, slightly whiny voice. When he's winning, after we saw him at the by-elections, on a more front foot giving his conference speech, he presents a very different demeanour, and one that I think will be a lot more appealing to the public. So if he can keep up this momentum, I think perhaps we could see his personal ratings do a bit better.
Just to pick up on your theme of the by-elections and how damaging physically, metaphorically speaking, of course, they could be for Rishi Sunak. I think we can show you the headline in The Guardian. If we can't, I'll read it to you. It says, Labour prepares to force by-election if Tory MP Peter Bone is suspended. There it is, party to encourage Wellingborough voters to sign petition if Commons vote to suspend Bone today. That is this afternoon. This is after he was found guilty of acts of bullying and one act of sexual misconduct, both of which he denies. He said he's done nothing wrong and he wanted to continue to serve the people of Wellingborough. How will you vote this afternoon?
So I haven't read the entire report yet, and I will do that before I do vote.
Right.
And I think it's right that I do that.
So you haven't made up your mind?
I think it's right that I read the full report.
Will you be voting to suspend Peter Bone?
He appealed. The appeal was denied, so it's not like it's just the first judgment and there hasn't been an appeal process.
Well,
and my feeling is that we elect our colleagues onto those independent processes, and they have independent people on as well to make the judgment. I will be supporting their judgment. I think it's the right judgment, and I think that Peter Bone will not be probably the last that will be suspended and possibly a by-election in this Parliament. There are others down the line, and that's why Rishi would be better just to go to the voters now rather than having this drip effect
in terms of a general election.
Yeah.
When would you like a general election to be? If if it was in your power.
But I mean, I think the Prime Minister, particularly on things like the illegal migration, I want to see the Rwanda scheme implemented. I mean, it's not going to
change. So when would you like it? In May? Let's say it was May or October next year.
It comes when it comes. Is up to a Prime Minister.
Well, that we know.
It comes when it comes. Is up to a Prime Minister. I'm ready for it. But there's this point we were talking about the by-elections. About whether there's been vast swathes of people who've gone from voting Conservative, voting Labour. My experience is that hasn't happened in vast numbers.
They were disastrous. The last two by-elections were pretty disastrous.
But it's about what lies behind that. And actually, there's a huge number of undecided voters and our voters who are currently saying...
Well, that's clear. Let me just get from the commentators. When do you think this general election is going to be? You're going to have time when you go and visit Tom in his constituency to chat.
History would suggest that when a Prime Minister is losing, then the general election comes as late as humanly possible because they love clinging on to office. Because why wouldn't you?
May or October?
I think October. There's an optimism bias. They'll hope that something comes up.
Let's go to PMQs.
One, please, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I know that the sympathies of the whole House are with all those affected by Storm Babbitt, and in particular the friends and families of those who lost their lives. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I join the Prime Minister in expressing my sympathies to all those affected by the recent storms. But, Mr. Speaker, 2 million people just cannot be sustained from 20-odd aid lorries. Utter catastrophe is being unleashed in Gaza. Doesn't the Prime Minister now see that only a humanitarian ceasefire can bring about the scale of emergency aid that is needed? Of course, Israel has a right to defend itself in line with international and humanitarian laws, but we must also speak out when those laws are breached. So surely he agrees that depriving 2 million civilians, 1 million children of food, of water, medicines and fuel is not in accordance with international law. Will he press Israel to restore the supply of these essentials for the sake of innocent civilians and the future of the entire region?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's important that we do everything we can to get humanitarian aid to those who need it in Gaza, which is why on Monday we announced a doubling of our international aid to the region, and why the Development Minister is actively engaged with our partners on the ground to ensure that that aid gets to those people as quickly as possible.
Albert Coulson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Double child rapist and murderer Colin Pitchfork had yet another parole review hearing only a few weeks ago. I thank the Justice Secretary for having listened to me and engaged the reconsideration mechanism rule. Now, I know the Prime Minister doesn't have any decision-making role within the Independent Parole Board. It's independent of government, but it is a wing of the executive. It is not the judiciary. Now, does the Prime Minister agree with me that men who rape and brutally murder young women, as Mr Pitchfork did to Dawn Ashworth and Linda Mann in my constituency, does he agree that generally, as a point of principle, these sexual offenders should remain in prison for most of their natural lives?
I agree with my honourable friend that the public should be confident that murderers and rapists will be kept behind bars for as long as is necessary to keep the public safe. And that's why we're reforming the parole system. Our victims' bill will mean that minimising risk and protecting the public are the sole considerations in parole board decisions. It will also give the Justice Secretary the power to step in on behalf of the public and take a second look at decisions to release the most serious offenders, including murderers and rapists. And last week we announced that we will be introducing longer sentences for dangerous criminals. For the most heinous crimes, life will mean life.
We come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Can I join the Prime Minister on his comments about all those affected by these storms? Can I start by welcoming the new member for Mid-Bedfordshire? The first Labour MP ever to represent those beautiful towns and villages. He defied the odds, history, and of course the fantasy Lib Dem bar charts. Can I also welcome the new member for Tamworth? She will be a powerful representative for her constituents. Is the Prime Minister as relieved as I am that those constituents are not burdened with his defeated candidate who told them, don't worry, Mr Speaker, I'm going to sanitise this, to F off if they're struggling with the cost of living?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm proud of what this government is doing to support the most vulnerable over the past year. But, Mr Speaker, can I in fact join him in welcoming the new members to their places? After all, I suspect the new member for Mid-Beds may actually support me a little bit more than the last one. Although I did notice that the new member said that they will be opposing new housing in their local area, while the new member for Tamworth claimed that they will protect green spaces. I would urge them to have a word with their leader, because that's not exactly his position, Mr Speaker, although with his track record of U-turns, who knows what his housing policy will be next week.
Well, so much for being the change candidate. He can't even distance himself from those appalling comments. But I do have to ask him, where on earth does the Prime Minister think his candidate got the idea in the first place that throwing expletives at struggling families was his government's official position?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, let's just look at the record of what this government is doing to help those people. Paying for around half of a typical family's energy bill over the last year, support worth over £1,500. For the most vulnerable in our society, receiving £900 in direct cost of living support, record increases in the national living wage, record increases in welfare, and this winter, Mr Speaker, pensioners to receive an extra £200 or £300 alongside their winter fuel payment to help them through what we know is a tough time. All of that, Mr Speaker, significant support funded by this government, all of that would be put at risk by Labour's reckless plans to borrow £28 billion a year.
He keeps boasting about how great things are. The voters keep telling him he's got it wrong. But I can see why the Tamworth candidate thought he was just following government lines. Annalisa and her 2 children lived in their home for 8 years. In May, they were kicked out with a no-fault eviction notice. Despite his government's pledge to scrap no-fault evictions, this week the Prime Minister crumbled to the landlords on his own backbenches and killed the policy. What message, other than the message delivered by his candidate in Tamworth, could Annalisa possibly take from that?
Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, we've taken significant action to help renters like Annalise and others. We've capped holding deposits at 1 week. We've protected tenants from rip-off tenancy fees, delivered almost 500,000 affordable homes for rent, and halved the number of percentage of substandard homes in the private rented sector, and strengthened local authority enforcement powers, because this government is delivering for renters. But we are also, Mr. Speaker, trying to ensure the new generation can buy their own home. So perhaps he can explain to Annalisa and thousands and millions of others why, when we brought forward plans to unlock 100,000 new homes, he stood in the way of that.
Just to say, it's Prime Minister's questions, not opposition questions. Keir Starmer. I'm sorry, Prime Minister. It is Prime Minister's questions. I don't need you nodding against my decision. Yes.
Well, I'm sure Annalise and her children, who've now been evicted, will take great comfort from that non-answer. Emma and her teenage son saw their mortgage go up by more than a quarter. They may think this is funny. This is real life. After 16 years of dutifully paying their mortgage, for the first time, she's having to choose between new shoes for her son and putting the heating on. All because his party crashed the economy, pushing mortgage rates to their highest levels in decades. He says ignore all that. Ignore the fact that the guilty men and women responsible are standing again as his candidates and still setting his policy. Can he not see why Emma might think that his party is telling them exactly where to go?
Mr. Speaker, he keeps talking about the mini-budget. I won't ask him a question, Mr. Speaker. Well, I will just point out he did actually support 95% of the things in that mini-budget, which I didn't, Mr. Speaker. But again, he's had a whole summer to get on top of the details. He's still ignoring the fact that rising interest rates are a global challenge. They are at their highest level in America and Europe for more than 20 or 30 years. Mortgage rates have doubled in America, trebled in Europe. Now, what we do want to do to help mortgage holders is ensure that they can use the mortgage charter that we've agreed with the banks. And thanks to the steps that we've taken, someone with a £200,000 property with about £100,000 left on their mortgage could save over £350 a month and lock in a new deal 6 months before theirs ended, and repossessions will be prohibited for 12 months from the first missed payment. He might have missed that policy is twice as generous as Labour's.
Absolutely tone deaf. In every cafe, pub and supermarket in Britain having the same conversation. We can't afford that. Put it back on the shelf. It's too expensive. He is completely oblivious, just patting himself on the back. Emily and Jamie have worked hard and saving for years to buy their own home. They were nearly there last year, but he scrapped house building targets because his backbenchers pushed him around. House building has fallen off a cliff, shattering the simple dream of home ownership for people like Emily and Jamie. Can the Prime Minister now see that actually his candidate in Tamworth was just loyally following the party line?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think these prepared lines really aren't working for him anymore. He literally asked a question. He literally asked me a question about the support that we're providing for mortgage holders. I gave him the answer to that question, and then he read from his script to say that we hadn't answered the question. We're providing significant help for all these people. He's moved on to housing targets, but here's the record. 2.5 million additional homes. Housing starts double what we inherited from the Labour Party. Housing supply up 10%, on track to deliver 1 million new homes, and a record number of first-time buyers, Mr. Speaker. But again, he brings up his candidates in Tamworth and Mid-Beds. As we open this session, he's now saying he wants to build homes. Well, both of those candidates want to say that they want to block new homes in their constituency.
Tell us more about
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, across our country, the British people are rolling up their sleeves and getting on with it, doing their best in the face of a punishing cost of living crisis and a government that has abandoned them. abandoned renters at risk of being kicked out, abandoned mortgage payers struggling to make ends meet, abandoned those who dream of owning their own house. The truth is, his candidate in Tamworth summed up perfectly just how his and his Tories are treating the British public. So will he just call a general election and give the British public the chance to respond, as they did in Selby, Mid-Beds and Tamworth? They've heard the government telling them to F off, and they want the chance to return the compliment.
Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, look, as we saw with his recent decisions on actually building new houses, politicians like him always take the easy way out, Mr. Speaker. Whereas we're getting on making the right long-term decisions to change this country for the better on net zero, on HS2, on a smoke-free generation, on education and energy security. Contrast that to his leadership. Too cautious to say anything and hope that nobody notices, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell him, come that general election, the British people will.
I said "oh," not more. Oh.
It's the first time I've been confused with the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker.
There's been many rumours about you.
And it will be soon. And all of them true, Mr. Speaker. Like me, my right honourable friend has the honour and privilege of representing a rural constituency. I'm sure he, like I, occasionally feels a certain degree of frustration that whilst progress has been made in this area, the rubric of funding formulae for things like the Environment Agency, local government, the police and education still fails to adequately reflect the difficulties and challenges of delivering public service in rural areas. Can my right honourable friend, the Chancellor and the wider government use the opportunities of both the autumn statement and the forthcoming budget to explore these issues further, to give a better delivery of service for his constituents and for mine?
Can I thank my honourable friend for raising this important issue on behalf of both his and my constituents. It's vital that we have the same high-quality services in rural areas as well as our towns and cities. I am pleased to tell him that we're providing £95 million through the Rural Services Delivery Grant to help rural councils achieve exactly that. We are currently reviewing the police funding formula, and I remember working with him to ensure that the national funding formula for schools does take account of the differing characteristics of schools and their pupils. But we will continue to keep all these things under review, and I agree with them entirely. Our rural communities must be given the same funding and public services as everyone else in our country.
SNP Deputy Leader Murray Blatt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the UN warned that hospitals in Gaza had just 48 hours of fuel left to keep their electricity going. That was 28 hours ago. The electricity runs out tonight. Now, we have a human responsibility to all the people in Gaza, but we have a particular responsibility for UK citizens, some of whom are in those hospitals with no food, no water, no medicine and no way out. So I want to ask the Prime Minister, how much worse does the situation have to get before he will join us in calls for a humanitarian ceasefire?
Mr. Speaker, from the start, we have said that the first and most important principle is that Israel has the right to defend itself under international law. Our support for that position is absolute and unchanged. But from the start, we have also said that we do want British nationals to be able to leave Gaza, and that we want hostages to be released and for humanitarian aid to get in. And we recognise that for all of that to happen, there has to be a safer environment, which of course necessitates specific pauses as distinct from a ceasefire. And we discussed this with partners yesterday evening at the United Nations. And we have also been consistently clear that everything must be done to protect civilians in line with international law and continue getting more aid flowing into Gaza.
Murray Blatt.
Mr. Speaker, the growing calls for a ceasefire is also about calming the situation in the broader region, especially the West Bank. UNICEF has reported over 2,000 fatalities and over 5,000 injured children since the conflict began due to unrelenting attacks. If we ignore this, we risk pouring petrol on a fire in a place that only requires a spark to ignite. Can the Prime Minister understand that joining calls for a ceasefire is now the best and maybe the only way to stop this conflict escalating beyond all control?
Mr. Speaker, we do have to remember that Israel has suffered a shockingly brutal terrorist attack. Hamas is responsible for this conflict and has the right to protect itself in line with international law. As the UN Charter makes clear, we will continue to urge the Israelis to follow international law, whilst we also have to remember that Hamas cruelly embeds itself in civilian populations. But we are doing everything we can to get aid into the region. I'm pleased to say an RAF flight left the UK this morning for Egypt carrying 21 tonnes of aid for Gaza. The relief supplies include over 75,000 medical kits, solar lights, water filters for families and warehousing equipment. Our team are on the ground ready to receive. We will continue to do everything we can to increase the flow of aid, including fuel, into Gaza.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the matter of Wally's Quarry, my constituents in Newcastle-under-Lyme have been utterly let down and failed by the Environment Agency. Not only have they failed to prosecute a rogue operator for the repeated breaches of their permit, we now learn that all of their monitoring equipment for the last 7 years, including in your constituency, Mr. Speaker, has been grossly under-recording levels of hydrogen sulphide by a factor of approximately 2 or 3 times. That's the monitoring equipment that people have been relying on to tell them that their air is safe and clean to breathe. Given everything that's happened, we really need to see some proper action now. I've had enough with the EA, and my constituents have too. So will the Prime Minister do everything in his power to get a grip on this failing organisation?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the concerns of his constituents. The Environment Agency's criminal investigation is ongoing, so I hope he can understand that I can't therefore comment further on it. But with regard to his concerns about the measurement inaccuracies, I have been assured and checked the Environment Agency is working swiftly to understand the scale of the problem. The Environment Secretary is currently monitoring the situation, and I have asked that she keeps my honourable friend regularly updated.
Colm Eastwood.
Mr. Speaker, a few short months ago the world came to Belfast to celebrate the Good Friday Agreement. At the heart of that agreement was the realisation that we could not use violence as a tool for revenge or to achieve our political aims. As 1,400 Israelis and almost 6,000 Palestinians lay dying and dead, when will the Prime Minister say enough is enough? When will he call for a ceasefire? When will he tell Israel to stop meting out collective punishment on the people of Gaza? And when will he and other world leaders insist on a political solution that involves a Palestinian state for the Palestinian people?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said, an important principle is that Israel does have the right to defend itself under international law to ensure that attacks like this, which were brutal and horrific for their citizens, can't happen again, and we continue to support that position. But as I said from the start, we've also wanted to ensure humanitarian aid can go in and hostages and nationals can come out. We recognise that that means there has to be a safer environment, which of course necessitates specific pauses as distinct from a ceasefire, and we discussed exactly this with our international partners yesterday at the United Nations and will continue to do so. And as I made clear on Monday, we have doubled down on our efforts to find a better future for the Palestinian people. It's been a feature of all our diplomacy in the region, and we will continue to give all our efforts to making that happen.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For too long, Bradford Council have failed to represent the best interests of my constituents, whether it be their catastrophic failures on children's services, their inability to invest our own council tax back into Keighley and Ilkley, or their refusal to instigate a review into child sexual exploitation across the Bradford district. Local residents and I are fed up of being ignored by Bradford Council, and we want out. So will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss my case for leaving Bradford Council and creating our own unitary authority which better represents Keighley and Ilkley, putting our priorities first?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know my honourable friend is a passionate campaigner on this issue, indeed even introducing a private member's bill earlier on it this year, and I agree with him that his council should be working to ensure that it delivers good services for all its residents, including his constituents. I will certainly arrange for the relevant minister to discuss his concerns further, and as he didn't do it, maybe I can plug his event this afternoon, I believe, in the Jubilee Room, the Keighley and Ilkley showcase, where perhaps the minister can come to discuss it in person then.
Graham Morris.
It's just a year ago now that the new Prime Minister promised to unite our country, not with words, but with action. Quite rightly, voters make a judgment on actions. But in my constituency, as in many others, the Prime Minister hasn't delivered on his promises. Arbroath House in Easington Colliery is a GP practice without the funding to deliver basic community health services. Communities like Shotton, South Hetton, Hassel and Horden lack the police officers to tackle crime and antisocial behaviour. We see sewage being dumped on our coastline at Seaham and Blackhall without prosecution of the privatised water companies. We see investment for levelling up blocked for Horden. When will the Prime Minister call a general election and let Labour rise to the task of rebuilding Britain?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman raised crime. I'm pleased to say that crime is now down by over 50% since Labour were last in office, and that includes significant reductions in antisocial behaviour, which you mentioned. And indeed, earlier this year, not only did we meet our pledge to deliver 20,000 more police officers, a record number on our streets, our antisocial behaviour plan is already making a difference, delivering immediate justice and clamping down on that type of activity.
Okay, now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rightly support the government's plans to build more homes and ease housing shortages. However, I have significant concerns about the impacts of developments on our ageing drainage systems and the potential risks that this poses for flooding, as we're seeing in places like the Hazel Walls development in Uttoxeter. What steps will the government take to ensure that as more houses are built, existing infrastructure is also upgraded and maintained by local authorities to ensure it's not overwhelmed with additional use and less permeable surfaces?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend knows, our traditional drainage systems are under increasing pressure, and that compares with the benefits of sustainable drainage systems, which work in a different way. It was already a requirement that sustainable drainage systems should be given priority in any major new developments and developments in flood risk areas. But earlier this year, we committed to requiring sustainable drainage systems in all new developments, in top of DEFRA's Plan for Water, which puts a statutory duty on water companies produce plans to set out how they will improve, maintain and extend our robust and resilient wastewater systems.
Charlotte Nettle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I hosted the MS Society and people living with multiple sclerosis to hear about their experiences accessing personal independence payments. 10 years on from its introduction, people with MS and other fluctuating conditions are still too often being denied the support that they deserve to manage the extra costs of their condition and to retain their independence for longer. 22,524 people with MS have signed a petition calling for a full review of PIP for fluctuating conditions, which is on its way to Downing Street right now. Will the Prime Minister listen to their call?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the experiences of those suffering with MS that she mentions. I'll ensure the Work and Pension Secretary looks at their concerns and writes to the Honourable Lady.
Sir Peter Bottomley, Father of the House.
We know some duck serious questions today, aiming for electoral advantage in the future. Can I note that the Prime Minister prefers to take decisions that will benefit the country now and the longer term, so that we can have more jobs, better education and a shared prosperity?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his kind words.
Mr. Speaker, while the final report of the infected blood inquiry has been postponed until March, Sir Brian Langstaff, the independent chair, has already published his recommendations on compensation for victims of that scandal. Can the Prime Minister explain why his government insists on postponing its response until after publication of the final report, kicking it into the long grass and delaying justice once again for my constituents Justine, Rachel and Paul, whose fathers died as a result of that scandal, as well as thousands of others across these aisles?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said previously from the dispatch box, what happened was an appalling tragedy, and my heart goes out to all of those affected and their families. I've given extensive evidence to the inquiry, so my position on this matter is on the record, but I would say there is extensive work that has been going on in government for a long time, coordinated by the Minister for the Cabinet Office, as well as interim payments of £100,000 being made to those who are affected.
Simon Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has been a great champion of transport projects on the Welsh borders, including the electrification of the main line in North Wales, the reopening of Corwin Station and the Gabowen to Oswestry line, and also substantial levelling up fund investment in the Llangollen and Montgomery canals. Would the Prime Minister now deliver on the long-awaited Pan-Llanymynech bypass and also prioritise the dualling of the A5, A483 in Clwyd South and North Shropshire?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are making significant improvements to our cross-border rail services across the Union. Thanks to our decision on HS2, we can now provide an unprecedented £1 billion of investment to fund the electrification of the North Wales main line that will ensure reliable, punctual journeys between North Wales and multiple cities across west of England. We also are continuing to develop the Llanymynech bypass scheme in our next round of the road investment plans, and the section of the A5 in England will be considered by National Highways as part of the Midlands to Gloucestershire to Wales route strategy.
Lillian Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important that the COVID inquiry has all the relevant documents. That's what the public, including thousands of bereaved families, expect and deserve. But despite being a self-described tech bro, the Prime Minister has been unable to locate and provide his WhatsApp messages to the inquiry. Does he agree that devices should be handed over to experts to retrieve this information?
Mr. Speaker, both the Government and I have fully cooperated to provide tens of thousands of documents to the COVID inquiry, and I look forward to giving evidence later this year.
Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With the ongoing national crisis in NHS dentistry being raised here most weeks, can my right honourable friend advise as to when the dentistry plan produced by the Department of Health will be published? And can he ensure that any clawed back, unspent funds are ring-fenced for NHS dentistry so as to deal with emergencies and to help clear the backlog?
Mr. Speaker, we're investing £3 billion into NHS dentistry, and the reformed dental contract is helping to improve NHS access for patients. In the last year, I'm pleased to say NHS dental activity also increased by almost a quarter compared to the year before, but the forthcoming dental recovery plan, which will be out shortly, will include action to incentivise dentists to deliver even more NHS care.
Ruth Cabret.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is an honour to be elected to this place, and the standards by which we are expected to abide matter. So does the Prime Minister accept that it was ill-judged for him to fail to declare to Parliament that companies linked to his wife had benefited to the tune of £2 million from a fund he had set up as Chancellor? Will he correct the record now? Shocking.
Mr. Speaker, it's worth bearing in mind that the Labour frontbenchers backed the Future Fund when it was introduced. Indeed, they were calling for more funding for it, not less. The House will be aware of my wife's shareholdings in various British startups, so that's her career, which are on the record, and I'm happy to put on the record again. But it is worth bearing in mind that the Future Fund helped over 1,200 different companies. Neither the government nor the British Business Bank chose any of those specific investments. It was open to any British firm that met the criteria.
Siobhan Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK is at risk of being left behind on hydrogen engines, hydrogen ice. The EU and the USA are now recognising hydrogen combustion engines as zero emissions and are supporting their industries as all viable zero carbon technologies will be needed, particularly for our HGVs, according to the RHA. So I'm working with Borg Warner Fenia on ice and many MPs because this is crucial for UK jobs, skills and manufacturing. Will my right honourable friend commit to urgently extending the scope of the Automotive Transformation Fund industrialisation grants to include hydrogen engines so we win the ice race?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government is determined to ensure that the UK remains one of the best locations in the world for automotive manufacturing. Hydrogen fuel cells and their upstream supply chain are already in scope of the ATF, and support for this fund has enabled Johnson Matthey's £60 million investment in Hertfordshire to develop hydrogen technologies. But I am told by the Minister that DBT are continuing to look at the future possibilities for renewable hydrogen and will consider the fund's eligibility in light of the new developments in this space.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's an email in my inbox from a constituent who has family in Gaza. It reads, "My heart can't handle this anymore. We are being massacred, relentlessly bombed, homes are being destroyed, no water, no food, no electricity. Save the Children reported that one child is killed every 15 minutes. And as I speak, the lives of 130 babies in incubators are in danger if fuel does not reach their hospital in time. This is collective punishment of the Palestinian people in Gaza for crimes they did not commit. How many more innocent Palestinians must die before this Prime Minister calls for humanitarian ceasefire?"
Well, Mr. Speaker, I welcome that there is, in fact, unity across these dispatch boxes on Israel's right to defend itself in face of an unspeakable act of terror. But it is also clear that we must support the Palestinian people. They are victims of Hamas too. Hamas uses innocent people as human shields, and we mourn the loss of every innocent life, people of every faith, of every nationality, and we are working as hard as we can to get as much humanitarian aid into Gaza as quickly as practically possible.
Final question, Dr. Dan Poulter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, Suffolk experienced its worst local floods for over 100 years, with communities in and around Needham Market, Framlingham, Debenham and Wickham Market particularly badly affected. Homes and businesses have been destroyed. And Suffolk, the community, has rallied together in a very stoic and pragmatic way to support those in need at this very difficult time. But what longer-term support can the Prime Minister offer to the people in Suffolk, those businesses and homes that have been affected by these floods, to help them to recover and rebuild?
Well, flooding is a devastating experience, and I extend my sympathies to all those affected, including those in his own constituency. I'm pleased to say that that's why, through the flood recovery framework, we are confirming additional financial support for those households and businesses most affected. This will include a £500 grant for households, council tax discounts and business rates relief of up to 100% for 3 months. Small and medium-sized businesses will also be eligible for £2,500 business recovery grant and up to £5,000 grants for flooded homes to make them more resilient for future flooding. We recognise the heroic efforts, Mr. Speaker, of local councils like his and emergency responders everywhere who have been working tirelessly in affected areas. They have our thanks, and we also stand ready to consider any requests from councils for support in their recovery efforts.
That completes questions.
To the end of this week's session of Prime Minister's Questions. It's the first one since the by-election defeats. Labour won both of those seats. They were pretty stunning victories for the Labour Party, and Keir Starmer welcomed his new MPs. Let me welcome guests for this part of the show, for the government. In fact, you've been here an awful lot in this studio. Andrew Bowie, Energy Minister, he's the only one allowed out at the moment by Conservative Central Office. And for Labour, Nick Thomas-Symonds, Shadow Minister without portfolio for the BBC, our Chief Political Correspondent, Henry Zeffman. Welcome to you. What did you make of it? There was something of a slight sort of reset, if you like, to use that word, following those by-elections. Very bruising for the government and for Rishi Sunak, and there'll be a certain amount of pressure on him. But Keir Starmer returned to cost of living broadly.
It feels like politics is back. If you remember Prime Minister's Questions last week, which was the first one after the party conference season, it was an unusually unified session of Prime Minister's Questions. You had Keir Starmer talking about what's happening in Israel and Gaza and broadly agreeing with Rishi Sunak. This week was much more like Prime Minister's Questions usually is. You saw them both setting out what I think really are going to be the contours of politics between now and the general election. Keir Starmer trying to make an argument that Rishi Sunak has let down all these different groups across society. At the end, he talked about how he had abandoned renters and mortgage payers and people who want to own their own homes. That's not just about housing. That basically is most of the country. And Rishi Sunak, in response, continuing the argument that we heard from him at the Conservative Party conference, that he agrees that the public deserves a change, but he thinks he is that change rather than Keir Starmer.
Well, let's focus on one of those issues, and that is renters being let down by the government. And that is because the Renters Reform Bill is no longer going to have this ban on no-fault evictions in England, which had been promised in the manifesto, because it will be indefinitely delayed until after the court system, we hear, is reformed. So Keir Starmer's right. You are letting down renters.
No, we remain committed to supporting tenants, and we remain committed to reforming the system. But it's
when will it be?
Well, as you just said, after the court system has been reformed.
And how long will that take?
Well, look, we are working hard to ensure that renters, tenants are much more supported, that they have much more control over their future and their living situations than is the case at the minute. We've got a very proud record when it comes to actually house building. We've delivered 2.5 million new homes since 2010. 600,000 of them are affordable. We want to go further and support renters. We've got some work to do to address some of the concerns that were raised in Parliament this week. That's absolutely clear, but we will do. It's the Labour Party that is stopping the building of 100,000 new homes. It's the Labour Party that ordered their members in the House of Lords to actually vote against changes to nutrient neutrality, which would allow us to actually build more new homes for people in this country to live in. So I understand the concerns, I really do, and it's why we are working hard to address some of the legitimate issues that were raised in the debate this week. That's what government should do. It should listen to the concerns, the debate and the arguments and work to address those. We will do that, but we are committed to supporting renters.
Well, let's return to the issue more broadly, not just renters, but also mortgage payers. People who own their homes are going to find when they come off their fixed mortgages at any point this year or next that they're going to be paying far higher mortgage payments. This is a year on, of course, from when Rishi Sunak took over from Liz Truss and what's widely regarded as a disastrous mini-budget that she and Kwasi Kwarteng oversaw. Again, another group of people that are going to struggle to pay those higher payments when they come off.
The package of support that we've put in place to support mortgage payers in this country has been signed up to by 95% of mortgage lenders.
Is it going to meet the difference?
It's actually more generous than anything that the Labour Party has ever proposed.
But they're not in government.
But we recognise, obviously, the cost of living situation.
It was a disaster, that mini-budget.
We recognise the cost of living situation. We recognise that interest rates are higher than they should be. By the way, the inflationary impact of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine has been felt around the world. We are taking action to address that, which is why it's the #1 priority of this Prime Minister and why we're on track actually to halve inflation. Because if we get inflation down, we can reduce interest rates, and that's good for everybody.
Right, and you admit inflation is coming down. Yes, the prices are still increasing, but the rate at which they're increasing is slowing and has done so over the last few months. So progress is being made.
Well, I wouldn't describe the Prime Minister as making progress over the past year. And just to take a couple of examples, just take the no-fault evictions. Now, the abolition of no-fault evictions was promised in the Conservative manifesto. It's something that would get wide support across the House of Commons, but it's yet another example, I'm afraid, of this weak Prime Minister capitulating to his own backbenchers. They should just bring it forward.
Right, what about the Select Committee that actually says it would be better to wait until there has been reform of the court system? I mean, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Not really. They should press ahead. They've had 13 years to reform the courts system. Well, this is vital to people now who are losing their homes in circumstances they wouldn't need to if the government actually acted. So they should press on.
We are acting, but it's right that we allow the court system to be reformed to allow us to move ahead and actually implement these reforms. And it's also right that we listen to, address and act on the legitimate concerns raised by members of Parliament across the House this week so we can actually bring forward legislation that actually works and will benefit renters in this country.
The promise was in your 2019 manifesto. You've had nearly 4 years to work.
We've delivered a lot in the 4 years, actually, and I've already demonstrated the house building that we've undergone in this country since 2010. The fact that we've got 600,000 more affordable homes on the market right now for first-time buyers is an incredibly good thing. Yes, we need to support renters more, which is why we're bringing forward this legislation. But we're in
So
years...
Is your serious position that the Conservatives have built enough houses in the past 13 years?
No, we want to build more. You're the one stopping us doing it.
No, I mean, that's absolute nonsense.
It's not nonsense. It's not nonsense. You supported the government position in the House of Commons, and as soon as it got to the House of Lords and you saw a political opportunity to defeat the government, you ordered your members of the House of Lords to vote against the changes that would allow us to deliver more homes in this country. That is a fact.
A practical way forward on nutrient neutrality in the House of Lords that would allow you to build more houses without actually adding to the pollution in our rivers, which, by the way, is an absolute disgrace from this government, the amount of sewage already in our rivers. The reason there is not the house building we need is, yet again, as with the no-fault evictions, the Prime Minister does not have the strength to stand up to his own backbenchers.
Let me talk to you, Henry, about the Israel-Gaza situation, because during Prime Minister's questions, Labour MP Yasmin Qureshi read a letter from a family who are in Gaza at the moment, suffering, no doubt, from the Israeli airstrikes. She's calling, one of the Labour MPs, calling for a ceasefire. What do they want to see happen? What do they want to hear from both the government and the leader of the opposition?
For a few days and weeks now, there's been a bit of simmering discontent, generally at the grassroots level, activist level, councillors in the Labour Party, about the Labour Party's position, which is basically the same as the government's position, namely Israel has a right to defend itself, but it should follow international law and allow as much humanitarian aid as possible into Gaza. Now, that discontent began with an interview that Keir Starmer gave a couple of weeks ago, where he appeared to suggest that he thought Israel had a right to deny fuel and water into Gaza. He now says that isn't what he meant. He thought he was answering a different question. That sort of sparked the discontent. But as you saw there from Yasmin Qureshi's question, it has both spread to Parliament, to some of the Labour backbenchers from the grassroots, but also it's on a broader question now, because she called for a ceasefire. And that is not where the Labour front bench is, because that, people I talk to on the Labour front bench say, would mean not supporting Israel's right to defend itself, because the way in which they are trying to degrade Hamas is through airstrikes on Gaza.
Would you like to see a ceasefire?
Look, I think we all want to see this terribly devastating scenes come to an end. But our position is that Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel has the right to degrade Hamas. Israel has the right to seek the return of the hostages. I would say, though, that it is absolutely vital that humanitarian aid gets through to Gaza. And the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has spoken about a pause in order to get humanitarian aid through. We do support what the US Secretary of State is saying, because I do think we do need to get that humanitarian aid through to Gaza, where at the moment hours matter in terms of lives that can be saved.
Right. Well, some of the anger and frustration that Henry was talking about, you can see this tweet from Keir Starmer. I was grateful to hear from the Muslim community of the South Wales Islamic Centre. I repeated our calls for all hostages to be released, more humanitarian aid to enter Gaza, for the water and power to be switched back on, and a renewed focus on the two-state solution, answering the questions about why he seemed to be endorsing the right of Israel to turn off water and power in its effort to practice self-defence. Now, Keir Starmer's since faced criticism from the Islamic Centre in Cardiff, which has accused him of gravely misrepresenting a meeting of the Muslim leaders there. The statement says, our intention was to raise the concerns of the Muslim community around the suffering of Palestinians. There was a robust and frank conversation which reflected the sentiments Muslim communities are feeling at this time. We wish to stress Keir Starmer's social media post that we showed, and images gravely misrepresented our congregants and the nature of the visit. Should Keir Starmer apologise to the South Wales Islamic Centre? Is he sorry for the hurt caused?
Well, Keir has already, subsequent to the tweet that you've just read from, Joe, put out further tweets beneath it, setting out very clearly that he was there to listen to the stories of the humanitarian catastrophe that's happening. So that's already been done by Keir. And I think it's just very important to understand that the devastation that is going on, the lives are being lost. Keir was there to listen, and I think it was important that he did go to listen, and that's what he's made clear in the subsequent tweets to that.
Right, listen but not change his position.
Well, no, Keir's position that he set out, I think Keir has been right throughout this in terms of his position, but his position both that Israel has the right to defend itself. I mean, Hamas could release the hostages, and they should release the hostages, but also calling for that humanitarian support. That's been the consistent position.
I mean, it's a cross-party motion, Andrew, so Conservative MPs have also signed it, calling for a ceasefire. What do you say in response?
What I do say is I think it's right and proper, and we welcome the fact that they're across the front benches of both the main parties in Parliament. We share the belief that Israel has the right to defend itself. We stand full square behind Israel and its right to defend itself against the type of terror attacks that we saw just a few short weeks ago. We should also recognise that Hamas, a terrorist organisation, continue to fire missiles into Israel, that hostages are still being held, amongst them British hostages. Yes, there are innocent Palestinians who are caught in the middle of this battle between the IDF and their the Israeli Defence Force and their legitimate right to strike back at Hamas, given what has happened. And that is why the Prime Minister, and we welcome the support of Keir Starmer and the Labour front bench in this, is also calling for immediate access for humanitarian aid, and why I'm very proud to have seen just in the last few hours an RAF plane take off with aid from the UK. We have UK aid individuals in Gaza ready to receive that and to distribute that, and it's why we also support the United States of America's call for a specific pause, not a ceasefire, but a specific pause to allow for that humanitarian aid to reach where it is required.
Just briefly, we talked about the row between Israel and the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who said that the massacre by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum, and that there had been 56 years of suffocating occupation. The Israeli ambassador to the UN has called for him to resign. Should he resign for those comments?
I'm not going to get drawn into the comments of the UN Secretary-General. I think that, I said, what we've got to recognise is that there is a deep level of hurt and pain within Israel, and indeed within the Jewish community around the world at what happened just a few short weeks ago. And we've got to recognise that Israel, within the bounds of international law...
You've talked at length about the situation, but you have no response to the comments, very clear comments made by Antonio Guterres.
Our response is that we continue to support Israel's right to defend itself within international law, and we are calling for, alongside the United States of America, a situation which will allow the humanitarian aid
so he was wrong.
in to
you
support
didn't agree
individual
with those
Palestinians. The comments of the UN Secretary-General are for the UN Secretary-General to defend. We're continuing to stand full square behind Israel and to support humanitarian aid to get those
and the UN?
innocent Palestinians. Of course, we're confident in the UN. The United Nations is the forum to have those discussions. I'm not going to get drawn in the individual comments by the Secretary-General. I think we need to focus on the actual situation.
Well, the Israelis are furious. The Israelis are furious, and they've called on him to resign. What do you think, Nick Thompson? Is it enough to say I have no opinion or view or won't comment on what Antonio Guterres said?
I just don't think it's helpful for us to be getting involved. And I think the crucial thing here is we need the United Nations, Israel, Egypt, ourselves, the UK, the United States and other countries to be working collectively together to get that aid that's required into Gaza. And I don't think it's helpful for us to start stoking that particular...
Well, I don't think you have to stoke it. I think it's there already. I mean, either you agree with what Antonio Guterres said, or you agree with Israel that those comments were outrageous.
I think there's a chance that we can get distracted by an argument over language within the UN, when what we really should be doing is focusing on getting that aid in, as well as defending Israel's right to defend itself.
Let's talk about Peter Bone. We discussed it briefly before Prime Minister's questions, because MPs are expected to vote this afternoon on whether to approve a 6-week suspension for Peter Bone later today, after he was found to have committed acts of bullying and sexual misconduct against a member of staff. He denies all of that. The BBC has spoken to the former member of staff. We're joined by political correspondent Hannah Miller, who spoke to Peter Bone's accuser. Let's just have a listen to the former member of staff.
Peter's behaviour was erratic. His temper was often explosive. Like a pendulum, he'd go from one type of kind of personality to another. It was very hard to predict. They call it a siege mentality in terms of the relentless shouting, the screaming, the hitting. I entered Parliament with a lifelong dream of wanting to be in politics. I went in with all this hope and excitement, and then it became this horrid, brutal, dark experience that left me a broken shell of the young man I once was.
And the voice was by an actor there of the former member of staff. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Hannah Miller, who spoke to Peter Bones' accuser. Hannah, the complaint against Peter Bone from his former aide was first made in 2017. Why has it taken so long for this investigation to conclude?
Well, yes, so as you say, it was 6 years ago that the complaint was first formally logged with the Conservative Party. It did seem initially, the complainant said, that there was some progress. In the first year or so, the Conservative Party found that there had been a potential breach of its code of conduct, and the process was supposed to move on from there. But then everything seemed to go quiet. The former assistant spoke to us about feeling like he was being ghosted by the Conservative Party. He says he tried to find out what was going on, but felt that he was being left in limbo. Eventually, after 4 years of waiting, he turned instead to Parliament's Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme, which had been set up in 2018 to try to deal with these kinds of complaints. It was only when they actually contacted the Conservative Party that the Conservative Party's investigation seemed in some ways to come back to life. But at that point, the complainant decided that he would withdraw from the Conservative Party's process, partly because he wanted to go ahead with the ICGS investigation instead, partly, he says, because he was led to believe that it would be an adversarial hearing that would involve going face-to-face with Peter Bone. Now, the Conservative Party says that's not necessarily the case. There might have been some discretion in that situation, but it has admitted that there were delays to the processing of this investigation, and it's also said that its investigation, its processes have since been updated.
Right, I mean, Hannah, Peter Bone was promoted, though, to Deputy Leader of the House of Commons in July 22, whilst under investigation. Do you know how this happened?
And that is something that you really can't get away from in this case. This was the dying days of Boris Johnson's government. He had resigned as Conservative Party leader, but he remained on as Prime Minister for the leadership race to get underway. The complainant suggested to us that he found the decision to promote Peter Bone to be deeply disrespectful, but he said he wasn't necessarily particularly surprised by it. We have a political system that rewards loyalty to the leader, he suggested, and he doesn't necessarily think that it's something that Boris Johnson would have considered when these decisions were being made. We did try to put that to Boris Johnson. He hasn't responded to our requests for comment, but I think it does raise wider questions about the culture when those kinds of decisions are being made.
Hannah Miller, thank you very much. Why was he promoted, Andrew?
Well, I mean, that is a question for the government of the day and Boris Johnson. I was not a part of that administration, so I have no explanation as to why that decision was taken. What I will say is what this individual has been through is horrific. Nobody should go into work and experience the level of bullying and abuse that this young individual received. It's heartbreaking as a young person who did come into politics like that, who worked in a parliamentary office both in the UK and in the European Parliament, to hear somebody's dream of working in politics shattered in the way that it was, and that we do have to acknowledge the system obviously was not working when this complaint first went in. I am assured that the systems that have been put in place by the Conservative Party post this are much more robust, much better, and indeed that the parliamentary system that we introduced back in 2019 is a much better system than the one that existed before. But it's right and proper that all of this bullying, this harassment is rooted out. There is no place for it in British politics, right. And I am glad that eventually, albeit after a period of years, this individual situation has come to...
Right, well, on the basis of what you said, I mean, this is 2022, so, I mean, it's much more recent than the change in processes that you have just been outlining there. So there are questions, aren't there, still to answer in terms of the delays to the process, and the so-called improvements didn't work. Someone like this, you know, who's been found guilty, he denies it, was promoted.
I think the investigation actually began many years before 2022 in terms of the appointment of Peter Bone to the government.
Yeah, but he was promoted in July 2022.
Yes, absolutely. That's a question you would have to ask the Prime Minister.
Will you be voting to approve the suspension?
The government doesn't have a view on this. It's a free vote of members of Parliament across the House. We don't even know if there will be a vote. What I will say is this report was horrific.
Well, how would you vote?
I would vote for the suspension.
Right. Let's just go back to the beginning of our conversation, which was the aftermath of those by-elections, defeats for the government. And I mentioned the word reset. What is going on in terms of all the chatter about a reshuffle?
Yeah, it's the only thing that any MP I've bumped into in Parliament over the last couple of days wants to talk about.
That's not true.
Clearly I didn't bump into you, Andrew, but your colleagues who I did wanted to know what I was hearing, because there is suddenly a lot of chatter about a reshuffle. And you can understand why, because a government which is in trouble in the polls has limited and wants to project a narrative of change, has limited ways in which to do so. And it's had the party conference where Rishi Sunak presented himself as the change candidate, but he's still got a cabinet and, to an extent, a broader ministerial team, many of whom are holdovers from the Liz Truss government or indeed from the Boris Johnson government, because his imperative when he became Prime Minister was to soothe the divides in the Conservative Party rather than necessarily pick the team that he would have done with a free hand. So I think it's coming sooner rather than later. I don't think it's imminent, but there is clearly a lot of discussion going on at the top of government.
You've been defending the government an awful lot. In fact, this must be your third appearance on Politics Live after a marathon appearance on Thursday night. Are you looking forward to being promoted?
Look, all I'm focused on is the day job, which is A, representing the people of West Aberdeenshire, and B, supporting the government deliver its agenda.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be completely out of the world for you to be promoted, would it?
I mean, all the speculation rumours, very interesting, I know, to journalists, but I know that the vast majority of MPs are just focused on delivering for their constituents in the country.
All right, then. That's all we have time for. I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15, but thank you to all of my guests for joining me. Good afternoon.